The year was 1885, a time when the world was caught between superstition and the slow march of science, when shadows seemed longer and the unknown pressed closer than it does today. In a quiet European town, tucked away between fields that never seemed to end and woods that groaned under their own weight, something deeply unsettling was beginning to stir. This wasn't the sort of story written in history books, nor one celebrated in family records. It was a darker kind of history, the kind told only in whispers, the kind avoided by lantern light. And at the center of it all was a woman who lived alone, in silence. Her cottage leaned against the edge of the forest, crooked, slanted, and half choked by ivy. Windows were shuttered tight, even in daylight, as if to keep something from escaping. At first glance, she looked like nothing more than a recluse, one of many widows who drifted into obscurity during that century. But people noticed her. People feared her. She never spoke, and yet her presence seemed louder than words. She was known only for one thing: the jars. Rumors spread that her house was filled with them, jars packed tightly with teeth. Not animal teeth, not ivory trinkets, but human, pale little fragments of lives once lived. Some said she collected them as a midwife, keeping the first teeth of children she delivered. Others whispered something darker, that they came from the mouths of the dead, pulled in silence after burial. And yet, there was a third rumor, the most disturbing of them all, that some of those teeth belonged to children who had vanished. Vanished children were not uncommon in the 19th century. Roads were dangerous, diseases spread quickly, and records were poorly kept. But in this particular town, disappearances carried an echo, a pattern, an uneasy connection that led back to one crooked house at the forest's edge. By day, she was unseen. But at night, lantern light flickered in her window, and neighbors swore they saw her shadow moving back and forth, pacing endlessly, clutching something small in her hands. Some claimed they heard the faint rattle of glass jars, the clink of tooth against tooth, as though she was counting them, speaking in a forbidden language made only of silence. The silence was the worst part. She never denied the accusations. She never confirmed them either. She spoke to no one. Her silence became a kind of horror storytelling on its own, a blank canvas where every family painted their fears. Was she a collector of relics? A witch binding spirits? A grieving mother? Or a predator who hunted under moonlight? The town was not without its superstitions. People spoke of haunted places where voices lingered in stone walls, of post-mortem photographs where eyes seemed to follow you from the paper. Teeth, they believed, were not just bones. They were powerful, eternal. Long after skin and flesh decayed, teeth remained, like ghostly fingerprints, fragments of the soul that could not be destroyed. Look closely at a tooth, and you will see more than enamel. Cracks and stains carry the weight of a life. A smile once held it. A scream once broke against it. And in 1885, jars filled with them lined the shelves of her home. The first real sighting came from a pair of boys who dared each other to creep toward her cottage. They peered through the warped glass of her window, giggling nervously. What they saw silenced them forever. Inside, shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, each lined with jars. Inside those jars floated teeth, hundreds, maybe thousands, each one pale as moonlight. Some were small, the tiny beginnings of childhood. Others were cracked and jagged, belonging to adults who would never smile again. When the boys told their parents, the story spread like fire. It became impossible to ignore. Families locked their doors tighter. Mothers pulled children closer, and with each new whisper, the legend grew. It was around this time that a disturbing image surfaced, an old photograph, tucked inside a family album. At first glance, it seemed ordinary. A funeral portrait, the kind so common in the 1800s, when death was often captured in staged silence. Rows of black-clad mourners, their faces heavy with grief. But in the corner, blurred and half-hidden by shadow, stood a figure. The woman. Pale, stern, and clutching something small. When examined closely, many swore the object in her hand was a tooth. A single, gleaming tooth, reflecting the faint light of the photographer's lamp. The photograph unsettled everyone who saw it. Some called it proof of her obsession. Others said it was a trick of the light. But the seed was planted. The woman's silence, the jars, the vanished children, everything began to converge into something darker. And as night fell over the crooked house at the forest's edge, the town whispered of her again. They whispered of her jars. They whispered of her silence. And they whispered of what might be found inside. For in 1885, in that forgotten corner of Europe, she was no longer just a woman. She was a mystery. She was a warning. She was the beginning of a story that would stain the town's history forever. And it all began with a jar. A single jar of teeth, left where a child could find it. Fear has a way of spreading. In 1885, it did not spread through newspapers or wires, but through whispers, low, nervous words exchanged across fences, muttered in market stalls, passed from parent to child as warning. By the time the story of the strange woman and her jars of teeth reached every ear, the entire town had changed. This was no longer an ordinary community. It became a place drenched in dread, where shadows seemed thicker and even familiar streets felt haunted. Every door was bolted earlier. Curtains stayed drawn tighter, and children were warned never to stray too close to the crooked cottage that leaned against the forest's edge. The woman herself, silent and withdrawn, had not changed. She walked through town rarely, but when she did, her presence seemed to drain color from the day. People turned away. Conversations halted mid-sentence. It was not just what she was rumored to keep inside her home, it was what she carried with her. Always, tied at her waist, a small pouch. Some swore it rattled faintly when she moved, as though glass or bone shifted inside. Others said they had seen her slip her hand into the pouch and run her fingers across whatever lay within. Children imagined the worst. They whispered that the pouch contained the teeth of those who had vanished, each one still holding the voices of their lost owners. That if you listen closely, you might hear those tiny voices whispering in a forbidden language, begging to be set free. Fear makes imaginations cruel. Mothers told their children, "If you misbehave, she will take your smile." Fathers muttered, "Stay away, or you will end up as another jar on her shelf." And slowly, suspicion twisted into something more dangerous. The town had always lived with its share of unsettling history. Old photographs, left to fade in attics, sometimes revealed eerie details. Faces blurred too much, eyes staring too directly, shadows shaped like figures that should not have been there. Families carried stories of vanished children, of post-mortem photography that felt too lifelike, of haunted places where footsteps echoed without bodies to make them. But never before had their fears taken flesh in one living person. Now they did. And she was very real. It was said that when funerals passed her cottage, she sometimes stepped outside. She stood at the edge of her gate, watching silently, her lips curled in the faintest suggestion of a smile. Some swore her teeth looked sharp when she smiled, though perhaps it was just the flicker of torchlight, or perhaps their imaginations filling in gaps with horror storytelling of their own. One family told a story that shook the town. Their young daughter, Anna, returned home one evening pale and trembling. She had been walking past the cottage when she saw the woman crouched in her garden. In the dirt before her lay a row of small white objects, lined up neatly like seeds before planting. Anna leaned closer before she realized what they were. Teeth. The woman looked up, caught her watching, and slowly pressed her finger to her lips, a gesture of silence. Then, without a word, she scooped the teeth into her pouch. The girl never spoke again. She became mute, as if the sight had stolen her voice. To the townsfolk, this was proof enough. The woman's silence was contagious, a sickness that spread to those who saw too much. As weeks passed, fear deepened into obsession. Neighbors began to watch her house from a distance. They noted when her lanterns flickered, when smoke rose from her chimney, when shadows shifted inside. But no one dared step closer. No one dared confront her. For fear does not always bring courage, it often builds walls. And within those walls, stories grow taller, darker, and harder to contain. and the stories grew. Some said she was descended from a strange family who had once practiced forbidden rituals, speaking a language no one dared record. Others whispered that she had bargained with death itself, that each tooth was a toll paid to keep her alive while others around her withered and died. In a town already scarred by poverty and sickness, such rumors spread like fire through dry grass. Ordinary tragedies, the death of a child from fever, a worker crushed in the mill, a body found near the river, were no longer ordinary. They were tied back to her. She became the explanation for everything terrible. Fear turned the town against itself. People accused neighbors of consorting with her. Some families burned photographs of their dead, terrified that she might acquire them, that she might use post-mortem images to bind the spirits of their loved ones. Others buried teeth deep in fields, scattering them so she could never gather them whole. But the strangest detail came from those who dared look too closely at her home. On certain nights, they claimed they saw her digging near the tree line, burying jars beneath the soil. The jars glinted faintly in the moonlight, like pale skulls waiting to be uncovered. And when she finished, she pressed her ear to the ground, as though listening to something beneath. The town grew colder. The nights seemed longer. And yet, no one acted. The fear was too great, the silence too heavy. The woman remained in her crooked house, her shadow flickering by the lantern light, her jars rattling faintly whenever she moved. But then came a disappearance. A real one, and fear turned into something far darker. To the townsfolk of 1885, she was more than a figure of suspicion. She was a living riddle. The woman who collected teeth in silence was feared, yes, but she was also studied, watched, picked apart in whispers as neighbors tried to explain her away, to fit her into something they could understand. Yet the closer they looked, the stranger she became. Her name, though rarely spoken aloud, was whispered among the old. Records suggested she had once been a midwife, a woman who brought life into the world. For years, mothers had called on her when labor struck, trusting her steady hands, her knowledge of herbs, her quiet confidence. But those same records hinted at tragedy. Too many stillborns, too many mothers lost in childbirth. Whispers grew that her silence was not strength, but guilt. And then, almost suddenly, she vanished from that trade, retreating into isolation at the forest's edge. Her appearance unsettled everyone. Thin to the point of frailty, with skin pale as wax, her hair streaked with silver though she was not yet old. Her eyes were deep-set, shadowed, and seemed to look not at people but through them. She rarely lifted her gaze, yet when she did, children swore her stare was sharp enough to cut. Always, at her waist, that small cloth pouch tied with twine. It never left her side. The silence was the most terrifying detail of all. Days, weeks, even months passed without anyone hearing her voice. Some believed she could not speak, that her tongue had been taken in some ancient punishment. Others thought her silence was chosen, a ritual vow to some hidden truth. Yet there were rumors, faint and fleeting, of the rare times she had spoken. A shopkeeper once claimed she had muttered the name of a herb he didn't recognize. A farmer swore she had whispered something in a language he could not place, a forbidden tongue, low and echoing, that clung to him long after she passed. What words had she spoken? Were they fragments of prayer, or something closer to a curse? Her manner of living only added to the mystery. She tended a small garden behind her house, but rarely bought food in town. No one could say how she survived the harsh winters. She was seen carrying small bundles wrapped in cloth into the woods at night. Sometimes she returned empty-handed. Other times, villagers claimed she came back clutching bones or pale objects too small to see from a distance, but which glinted faintly under the moon. Her silence seemed to infect her surroundings. Birds were never heard in her garden. Dogs refused to approach her gate. Even the air around her cottage seemed heavy, as if sound itself had been swallowed by the crooked house. Children daring each other to creep closer swore that when they reached her fence, they could hear the faint chattering of teeth, like a jar rattling softly, even when she was nowhere in sight. But perhaps the most disturbing detail was her smile. She rarely revealed it, but those who claimed to have seen it never forgot. It was not a wide grin, not the joy of a kind-hearted neighbor. It was slight, deliberate, and chilling, lips curling as though at some private amusement. Mother said it looked like the smile of someone watching a tragedy unfold, savoring it. Father said it looked like the smile of someone who already knew the ending to your story. Some villagers insisted she was not entirely human. One elderly man swore he had known her as a child, yet decades later she looked unchanged, her face frozen in time. Others whispered she had been born under an eclipse, marked by fate itself. The children spun darker tales still, claiming she could not die, that her jars of teeth were her secret, each one a stolen fragment of a soul, keeping her alive while others grew old. What gave weight to these stories were the records she left behind. Years later, after her death, fragments of her writing were discovered in drawers and scattered among the dust, notes written in a hand that grew more unstable with time. Some were lists of herbs. Others appeared to be names, long columns of them, some crossed out, others underlined. And beside many names was a small mark, the symbol of a tooth. No one could say what it meant. Were they her patients? Her victims? Or something far more mysterious? But the strangest papers contained drawings. Rough sketches of human jaws, rows of teeth carefully shaded, notes scribbled in the margins in a language no one could fully decipher. Some suggested it was a forgotten dialect of the region. Others believed it was an invented script, something forbidden. A language meant not for speaking, but for binding, binding secrets, binding souls, binding silence. The woman who collected teeth was not simply eccentric. She was not simply a recluse. She was a living question, an unanswered riddle whose silence was more terrifying than screams. In her presence, the town felt watched, judged, weighed against something unseen. And yet, for all the fear she inspired, the truth about her remained hidden. Who had she once been? What had turned a midwife into a figure of dread? And most importantly, why teeth? Why something so intimate, so eternal, so unsettling? The town would soon have its answer. But it would not be one they welcomed, because silence can only hold back secrets for so long. And hers was about to break. For months, the stories circled like carrion birds. Jars of teeth, whispers of vanished children, the woman's silence heavy as a grave. But whispers can only terrify so much. It was not until the collection was seen that the town's fear became certainty. It began, as so many disturbing events do, with children. Two brothers, no older than 12, dared each other one autumn night to creep near her house. The air was sharp with cold, leaves crackling under their boots. They pressed themselves against the warped siding of her cottage and peered through a narrow gap in the shutter. What they saw froze them where they stood. Inside, shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Not with books, not with jars of herbs, but with glass containers, each filled with pale, ivory fragments, teeth. Hundreds of them. Thousands, perhaps. Small molars, jagged canines, cracked incisors, all floating in yellowed liquid that shimmered faintly in the lantern glow. The boys ran home screaming, and though parents scolded them for frightening the town, their descriptions matched too closely to be dismissed. Jars. Teeth. Too many for one lifetime. Too many for any reason that could be called ordinary. And soon, more sightings emerged. A farmer delivering wood claimed he glimpsed a jar when her door cracked open, rows of small white shapes pressed against glass. A midwife who once trained beside her swore she had seen the woman wrapping something bloodied in cloth, slipping it into her pouch with ritual care. A group of men passing her home at night insisted they heard the faint rattle of glass, followed by the unmistakable sound of teeth grinding against one another. The teeth collection was no longer rumor. It was fact, and the town could not look away. In the 19th century, teeth carried strange weight in folklore. Some families kept a child's first tooth as a charm, a sign of good fortune. Others burned them, fearing witches could use them in spells. Superstition whispered that a tooth contained a fragment of the soul, a piece of life that lingered even after death. In some cultures, they were buried beneath trees, believed to protect the living. But to gather them in such numbers? To hoard them in silence? That was something else entirely. Look closely at a jar of teeth. At first glance, they seem harmless, tiny relics of youth, tokens of a smile long gone. But the more you stare, the more the horror grows. The sheer quantity, the eerie details, teeth with roots still intact, some cracked as though wrenched out by force. Some belonged to children, too small to be from anyone older than 5. Others were jagged, adult molars blackened with decay. Each jar was not just an object, but a graveyard condensed, a museum of silent screams. And then came the discovery that deepened the dread. One man, drunk with courage, swore he had crept close enough to see inside her window. He claimed that each jar bore a handwritten label. Not dates, not medical notes, names. Names scrawled in her unstable script. Many of them matched the names of children who had disappeared, or mothers who had died under her care years earlier. Names lost in time, but kept in glass. It was this detail that spread panic like fire. For now the collection was not just eerie. It was personal. It was a ledger of lives. Theories multiplied. Some insisted she kept the teeth as tokens of her work, proof of every soul she had brought into or out of the world. Others whispered that she was binding spirits, using the teeth as anchors to keep the dead close. A darker tale spread as she ground them into powder, mixing them with herbs in rituals never meant to be seen. And yet, no one confronted her. The fear was too great. Instead, the collection became a silent presence in the town. When a child lost a tooth, families buried it quickly, terrified it might somehow find its way into her pouch. When someone died, neighbors guarded the body until burial, making sure she did not come near. And still, she was seen walking the cemetery paths at night, her shadow flickering in lantern light, her pouch clinking faintly with every step. But there was something worse than the jars inside her home. Something no one could explain. From time to time, teeth appeared outside the cottage. Small molars scattered on the path leading to her gate. Cracked incisors pressed into the mud as though dropped by accident. Some children swore they found them tucked into tree bark near her garden, as if the forest itself had begun to grow teeth. And always, the silence. No denial, no explanation. Just her pale figure, moving between her shelves, her hands carefully turning jars, as if arranging a library of the dead. The collection haunted the town more than any ghost story, because it was real. It could be seen. It could be touched. It was not a legend whispered by firelight, but a truth kept in glass, rattling faintly in the darkness. And yet, the worst was still to come, because jars filled with teeth are not just relics. They are records. They are warnings. They are questions begging to be answered. And soon, the town would find itself asking a question it was not prepared to hear answered. Where had all those teeth come from? The teeth alone might have been enough to brand her a monster. But in 1885, fear is never born from objects alone. It festers when people vanish, leaving nothing but questions and teeth to remember them by. The first to vanish was a boy named Thomas, 8 years old, the son of a shoemaker. He had been seen running errands one gray afternoon, his arms clutching a loaf of bread wrapped in brown paper. His mother swore she watched him cross the lane near the woman's cottage. He never came home. Days later, his bread was found in the ditch, untouched, but Thomas was gone. His name would later be whispered among those written on her jars. Next was Margaret, a young girl of 12. She had been known for her laughter, for the sound of her voice echoing in the meadows. One evening, her father called her in from the fields, but she did not answer. Only a ribbon remained, caught in a hedge near the cemetery where the strange woman often walked. Margaret was never found. And then came Joseph, a farmhand of 16. He had been strong, capable, not the kind to frighten easily. He vanished one market morning, his boots left neatly by a stall as if he had stepped out of them and simply ceased to exist. His disappearance, too, was followed by whispers of teeth. His family swore one of his front teeth, chipped in childhood, matched one they saw in the woman's collection. These were not isolated tragedies. They formed a pattern, a shadow creeping closer. Look closely at the old records of 1885, and you find gaps where names should be. Children marked as missing. Families torn apart. It is as if entire branches of the town's history were severed in silence. The strange woman's presence hovered over each case like a dark shroud. At first, authorities dismissed it as coincidence. The 19th century was a time when children often wandered too far, when disease or poverty carried lives away without warning. But as the list grew longer, and as the whispers of jars filled with labeled teeth spread, coincidence became harder to defend. Parents began locking their doors at dusk. Children were forbidden to linger near the cottage. Families clung to one another in church pews, casting fearful glances at the woman, who still sat in the back, silent, unmoving, as if the prayers around her were meant for someone else. And yet, the disappearances continued. One autumn evening, a group of boys discovered something chilling near the edge of the woods. In a hollow beneath an oak, they found a bundle wrapped in cloth, tied tight with twine. Inside were teeth, not scattered, not broken, but arranged neatly, as though placed with care. Some were far too large to belong to children. The boys fled, screaming, and the bundle was later taken by men who dared not speak of it again. Theories spread like wildfire. Some whispered she was a witch, using the teeth to bind the souls of her victims, ensuring they could never find peace. Others believed she was obsessed with post-mortem rituals, harvesting teeth from the dead to create her own private museum of decay. But the most disturbing belief was the simplest, that she took them while her victims still lived. In those days, medicine was crude, and tooth extraction was agony. No anesthetic, no comfort. Just the sound of iron tools scraping against bone. To imagine a child subjected to that torment, alone, in silence, was almost too much for the townsfolk to bear. Almost. And yet, they bore it. They did nothing. Fear paralyzed them. The woman walked among them freely, her eyes lowered, her hands clutching that pouch which clinked faintly with every step. Perhaps they feared that to accuse her was to invite the same fate as Thomas, or Margaret, or Joseph. But the most disturbing detail was yet to be discovered. One family, mourning the loss of their daughter, swore that they heard noises at night outside their cottage. Small knocks, like pebbles thrown against wood. When they opened the door one morning, they found a tooth on the threshold. A child's tooth. White and perfect, as though left there deliberately, as though someone was reminding them. That family left the town shortly after, abandoning their farm to ruin. Others considered doing the same. But where can you run when the darkness seems to follow you? When the very ground outside your home grows heavy with secrets? The vanishings continued, and with each new disappearance, the jars in the woman's home seemed heavier, the shelves more crowded, and always the silence. She never defended herself. She never explained. Not a word passed her lips. Imagine, for a moment, the sight of her standing before those shelves, rows upon rows of teeth, glinting faintly in lantern light. Each jar a monument to someone who had vanished. Each name a reminder that the town was slowly being emptied, soul by soul, smile by smile. The disappearances were no longer chance. They were deliberate, systematic, and the town knew it. But what terrified them most was the question that no one dared speak aloud. Where were the bodies? Fear is not born overnight. It grows in whispers, in glances exchanged in shadow, in stories repeated until they harden into legend. By 1885, the strange woman's name was no longer spoken in daylight. She had become a symbol, a warning, woven into the folklore of the town. It began with children's rhymes. They would sing them in hushed voices, daring each other to whisper her name after dark. She keeps your teeth in jars of glass, they chanted, and writes your name so you won't pass it. Some claimed that if you lost a tooth and didn't bury it beneath the hearth, she would come in silence and take it from beneath your pillow. Others swore that she could hear a tooth crack even from miles away, as if the breaking of enamel was a summons. Local legends rarely spring from nowhere. They twist fragments of truth into something that feels eternal. And here, the truth was chilling enough to feed the tales. Parents repeated these warnings to their children not out of amusement, but out of desperation. Better a child frightened by stories than missing from the table. Folklore painted her as something more than human. Some believed she was the daughter of a midwife who had dabbled in forbidden language, words so old that priests refused to speak them. Others said she had been born still, only to be breathed back to life by a mother who prayed to darker powers than God. It was whispered she had no shadow on nights when the moon was thin. Some swore her silence was not a choice, but a curse, her tongue stolen by the dead she had wronged. And always, the teeth returned to the center of these tales. Look closely at old European superstitions, and you find that teeth carried strange significance. In some villages, teeth were buried so animals could not dig them up and bring misfortune to the family. In others, they were cast into fire to prevent witches from using them in charms. To keep teeth was to keep a part of someone's soul. And in this small town, people began to believe she was building not a collection, but an army of souls bound to her jars, waiting for her command. The folklore twisted further with each disappearance. Children claimed to see her walking near the cemetery with a lantern, the light swaying as though guiding unseen followers. Others said they saw teeth scattered on their window ledges, arranged in strange patterns, like messages written in a language no one could read. One story told of a farmer who dreamed of her. In his sleep, he saw her standing at the foot of his bed, holding a jar. Inside was not only teeth, but a face pressed against the glass, suffocating in silence. The farmer awoke screaming and found a loose tooth on his pillow, though he had not lost one. He fled the town weeks later, leaving his land to rot. Another tale told of a girl who tried to mock the woman. She left a pig's tooth on the woman's doorstep, laughing with her friends. Days later, that girl developed a raging fever. Before the week ended, her body was lowered into the earth. Her friends swore they heard teeth rattling in the coffin as it was covered with soil. The folklore reached beyond the town itself. Travelers passing through carried the tales with them, spreading her legend like a sickness. Soon neighboring villages spoke of the Tooth Woman, a specter who crept in silence, harvesting what was not hers to take. In taverns, men swore she was centuries old, a revenant feeding on the innocence of children. Some even suggested she was death's midwife, collecting teeth as proof of every soul she ushered into the grave. And still, the townsfolk lived beside her. Fear is a strange thing. It paralyzes as much as it protects. They kept their distance, whispering prayers when she passed, crossing themselves when they heard the faint clink of her pouch. But they never banished her, never challenged her. Because legends, once they root themselves in fear, become untouchable. To accuse her outright would be to step into the story, to tempt fate, to invite the very darkness they feared. Look closely at these tales, and you will see a pattern. Folklore does not invent monsters, it preserves them. It carries forward the memory of something too dark to forget. And in this case, every rhyme, every whispered warning, every fireside tale pointed back to the jars of teeth, gleaming in the shadows of her home. The legend was no longer just about a woman. It was about something larger, an evil that felt older than the town itself. She was no longer flesh and bone in their minds, but a curse, an eternal figure bound to their soil, their children, their very mouths. And yet, legends have a way of shaping reality. Fear grows until it demands proof, until it demands answers, until it pushes someone too far. And in the winter of 1885, fear would drive the town to take a step it could never undo. By the winter of 1885, the fear had grown too heavy to ignore. Families whispered that they could no longer bury their dead in peace. Children vanished, and every loose tooth was hidden away like contraband. The strange woman's silence and her growing jars of teeth had become more than a local terror. They were an open wound in the town's history. And finally, someone called for help. The authorities came quietly. 2 constables from a nearby city, their uniforms stiff and unfamiliar against the muddy lanes of the village. They carried lanterns and notebooks, but little else. In those days, lawmen were not equipped for horrors. They were trained for drunks, for theft, for disputes over livestock. They were not prepared for jars of teeth. Still, they had heard the rumors. They had heard of vanished children, of names scratched onto jars, of teeth left on doorsteps. Folklore had spilled beyond the village, and now it was written in their reports, though in careful language, stripped of superstition. Suspicious activity. Suspected midwife. Collection of human remains. Cold words for something far more chilling. The constables knocked on her door one brittle morning, frost whitening the ground. She answered in silence, as she always did. They described her later as calm, though others said her face was too still, her eyes too hollow, as if she were carved from wax. She did not resist as they entered her cottage. Inside, their lanterns revealed what the villagers had only whispered about, shelves stretching from wall to wall. Dozens of jars. Hundreds. The light caught on enamel, making the glass shimmer like bone-white constellations in the dark. The constables stood in silence, the air thick with the faint odor of preserving fluid. One of them gagged. The other forced his hand to his notebook. But what words can you write when you are staring at thousands of teeth? Look closely at the official report. What little survives, and you find careful phrases. Collection appears extensive. Origin of remains undetermined. But between the lines, there is something they could not bring themselves to record. The sheer order of it. Every jar labeled. Every tooth arranged as though catalogued. Not chaos, but method. Not madness, but intention. One constable swore later that he saw names on the labels. Familiar names. Names already marked in the village records as missing or dead. Another claimed that when he touched one of the jars, it rattled faintly, though no hand had moved it. Neither detail appeared in their report. Some truths are too heavy for paper. They questioned her, of course. Asked where the teeth came from. Asked why she kept them, but she gave no answer. She only stared at them, her silence as sharp as any blade. And perhaps that was worse than words. For words can be denied. Silence becomes a verdict. The constables searched the rest of her home. In the small back room, they found her pouch. Inside were loose teeth, some fresh, some still marked with blood at the root. They found a table stained with dark streaks, though whether from medicine, herbs, or something else, no one could say. They found scraps of cloth, too small for clothing, as if once used to bind wounds or gag mouths. But what they did not find were bodies. No bones. No graves. No proof of murder. Only teeth, as though the lives themselves had been consumed by the jars, leaving nothing but enamel behind. And without bodies, what could the law do? The authorities were practical men. They saw what the villagers had seen, but the law demanded evidence. The woman was left in her cottage. The constables left with their notebooks, their lanterns, and haunted faces. In their absence, the town felt more cursed than ever, as though the law had peered into the abyss and then turned away. Rumors spread quickly. Some swore the constables were bribed to remain silent. Others believed they had been too afraid to act, convinced that taking the teeth from her would bring the curse upon themselves. Still others whispered that the authorities had added their own names to her jars, sealing their fates. The visit from the authorities gave the townsfolk no relief. Instead, it deepened the terror. Because now, the jars were no longer just a rumor. They had been seen, documented, confirmed. The law itself had gazed upon them and done nothing, which meant the town was alone. Alone with her. Alone with the teeth. And in the days that followed, the disappearances continued. One child. Then another. Each vanishing left only silence, only grief, and the faint, unbearable sound of glass rattling in the dark. The authorities had come. They had seen. They had left. But the jars remained, growing heavier, hungrier, filling with names that once belonged to living souls. And the town realized a truth more frightening than any legend. When law turns its back on horror, horror becomes law. The year was slipping toward its close, and with it, so too did the life of the strange woman who had haunted the town with her jars of teeth. The records speak little of her final years. The details are scattered, broken, like fragments of enamel themselves. Yet what remains is enough to chill the blood. By the late 1880s, she had grown frail. Her once quiet steps through the lanes became slower, her posture bent, her frame thin as a shadow. And yet the pouch still clinked faintly at her side. Even as her body failed, her ritual continued. Teeth never stopped appearing. Some claimed they saw her gathering them in the cemetery, kneeling in silence among the gravestones. Others swore she reached into her pouch during church sermons, fingertips brushing enamel like prayer beads. It was as though her life had fused with her collection, as if she could not breathe without the weight of those jars pressing against her walls. And the jars, in turn, multiplied. Visitors who glimpsed inside her windows whispered that the shelves had nearly collapsed under the burden. The cottage itself seemed to lean inward, sagging as though buckling under secrets too heavy to contain. But something else began to change in those final years. The vanishing slowed. Children stopped disappearing at the same pace. Some said it was because the town grew more vigilant, keeping its young close, never letting them stray near her path. Others believed her strength was fading, that her silence was no longer as sharp, her grip not as strong. Yet if the disappearances slowed, the fear did not. It deepened, because now the townsfolk believed they were living beside a ghost before the body had even died. The woman's pale figure drifting along the lanes at dusk seemed less like a human being and more like a shadow out of time, stretched thin across the earth. Look closely at the folklore that took root in those years, and you will find new stories. It was said that she could not die while a single tooth remained in her jars, that each one bound her soul to this world. Others swore they heard voices from her cottage, whispers rising from the glass, as if the teeth themselves had learned to speak in a forbidden language. There were those who claimed that at night, she lit every lantern in her home, and in that trembling light, the shelves of teeth glistened like grins of the damned. The final years also brought illness to the town. A wave of fever spread, and with it, more death. Some blamed her, insisting the disease was punishment, a curse unleashed from her collection. Others noticed something far more unsettling. The graves of the fever victims were not always safe. Families swore they had buried their dead intact, only to discover teeth missing when the coffins were disturbed. And then, sometime around 1889, the woman herself fell ill. There were no doctors called. No family to care for her. She was left to her cottage, left to her jars, left to her silence. Neighbors claimed that in those days they heard the clinking of glass more often, louder, almost frantic, as if she were preparing something, rearranging her collection for the end. One story tells that a boy, curious and reckless, crept to her window during her final weeks. He swore he saw her sitting in a chair, her body frail and trembling, her face hidden in shadow. But her hands moved ceaselessly, polishing each tooth, setting them back into jars with careful precision. The boy fled before she turned her head, but he carried the memory for the rest of his life. A dying woman, polishing eternity. Her death came quietly. No witnesses. No family at her side. One morning, smoke failed to rise from her chimney, and the silence of her cottage grew too heavy to ignore. When villagers finally forced their way inside, they found her in her bed, her eyes closed, her lips sealed, as though she had died without a sound, just as she had lived. But death did not end the terror, for her collection remained, shelves upon shelves of glass jars filled with the teeth of the vanished, the dead, the nameless. And here was the dilemma. What does one do with such things? Burn them? Bury them? Keep them? Every option seemed cursed. To destroy them might unleash whatever spirits they bound. To bury them was to plant evil in the soil, and to keep them was unthinkable. Some say the jars were smashed, the teeth scattered across the cemetery ground, lost among the roots and the stones. Others claim they were buried in a pit deep in the forest, sealed beneath layers of ash and earth. A few even insist the jars were stolen, carried off by men who could not resist the lure of such a collection. disappearing into history to surface in darker places. Whatever the truth, her final years did not free the town from her shadow. For years afterward, children whispered of teeth left on doorsteps, of rattling sounds in the night, of pale figures drifting near the cemetery. And still, no one could explain how so many had vanished, where their bodies had gone, or why she had gathered what she did. Her death closed a life, but it opened a legend, and legends do not die. Decades passed after her death. The cottage crumbled, the shelves collapsed, and the jars, whether buried, shattered, or stolen, were gone from sight. Yet evil rarely vanishes. It lingers in fragments, in stories whispered by candlelight, in objects left behind that should never have been captured. And in this case, it lingered in a single photograph. The image surfaced nearly half a century later, tucked away in a trunk belonging to an old family that once lived near the edge of the cemetery. The trunk contained letters, baptismal records, and brittle newspapers yellowed with age. But hidden beneath them all was a photograph that should not have existed. Look closely at the photograph. At first glance, it seems ordinary, faded sepia tones. A woman seated in a wooden chair, her body stiff, her face pale. Some assumed it was post-mortem photography, common in the late 19th century. Families often posed their dead as if alive, desperate to capture one last image before the body was lowered into the earth. But the more you stare, the more unsettling details emerge. Her lips are pressed tightly together, as though locked against a secret. Her hands, folded neatly in her lap, are not empty. She is holding a small jar. Inside, faint but unmistakable, are white shapes pressed against the glass. Teeth, and then the background. At first, it appears to be nothing more than the wall of her cottage. But shadows reveal themselves the longer you look. Rows of faint outlines, blurred by the limits of the camera, yet undeniable. Shelves, stacked high with jars. Hundreds of them, faintly reflecting the dim light. It is not just a portrait. It is evidence. Historians argued endlessly about the image. Was it taken while she still lived, a rare intrusion into her silent world? Or was it staged after death, a post-mortem display of her obsession, captured by someone who wanted the truth remembered? No one could agree. But what disturbed them most was that the photograph had never been catalogued. No one knew who took it. No one admitted to owning it. It had simply appeared, forgotten until found. And then came the chilling detail that sealed its place in legend. When enlarged, the photograph revealed something faint in the corner. A small shape, almost hidden in shadow. A child's face, pale, expressionless, pressed close to the glass of a jar. Some insisted it was nothing more than a trick of light, a flaw in the exposure. Others swore it was the reflection of one of her victims, captured in the very moment the shutter clicked. The photograph became a curse of its own. Families who saw it claimed to hear faint rattling sounds at night, like glass clinking together. One man who handled it swore his teeth ached for days afterward, throbbing as though each one were being pulled from his jaw. Another claimed he dreamed of her nightly, standing at the foot of his bed, the jar still clutched in her withered hands. It was said the photograph passed through many owners, but never for long. People returned it, destroyed it, or locked it away. Yet somehow, it always resurfaced. In flea markets, in estate sales, in the bottom drawers of forgotten cabinets. No matter how often it was lost, it came back as though it was seeking to be remembered. And so the woman's silence lived on, carried not in jars, but in an image frozen in time. The photograph became a mirror, forcing those who looked upon it to face the dark history of the town, the horror storytelling etched into every detail, the mystery that refused to die. It was a disturbing image not because of what it showed, but because of what it suggested, that her collection had not been destroyed, that the teeth were still out there, and that the shadows behind her chair held more than jars. Even today, some claim the photograph exists, hidden in private collections. Others insist it was destroyed in fire, though no record proves this. A few whisper that copies remain, reprinted without attribution, their origins disguised, waiting to catch the eye of the unsuspecting. And perhaps that is the true terror of the forgotten photograph. Not that it captures the face of a strange woman who collected teeth. Not that it reveals jars stacked high, or the ghostly suggestion of a child, but that it refuses to be forgotten. For photographs are more than images. They are invitations. They pull the past into the present. They remind us that what we fear most was real once, and may still be real, hidden just beyond the frame. The strange woman died in silence. But her photograph speaks still. And sometimes, if you stare long enough at those faded sepia tones, you may swear the teeth in the jar are not still at all. They are smiling. The year was 1885, and it began with whispers of a woman who walked in silence, collecting what no one else dared to touch. It ended with a cottage filled with jars, shelves stacked high with unsettling trophies, and a legend that refuses to die. Her name has been blurred by time, her story fragmented by rumor and fear. Yet the strange woman who collected teeth remains one of the most haunting mysteries in dark history. When we step back and look at the fragments, the vanished children, the jars of enamel and bone, the local folklore, the photograph that should not exist, an unsettling picture emerges. She was not merely a recluse. She was a figure who straddled the line between human and myth, a woman remembered not for her voice, but for her silence, not for her kindness, but for the chilling secrets she left behind. Some believe she was a collector of relics, fascinated by the human body in the way surgeons and grave robbers once were. Others claim she was driven by madness, her jars the only companions she ever allowed near her. And then there are those who whisper darker theories, that the teeth were not trophies at all, but offerings, tokens to something far older, something hidden in the folklore of the town, a forbidden language spoken only in silence. The unsettling history of the woman cannot be dismissed as mere superstition. The evidence lingers. Newspaper clippings describe strange disappearances that were never solved. Diaries mention the sound of clinking jars carried on the night wind, and that photograph, whether real or a trick of exposure, remains one of the most disturbing images tied to the 19th century. Each detail builds a story that feels both impossible and undeniable, an unsolved mystery lodged firmly in the shadows of forgotten events. Look closely at the story, and you will see echoes of other tales lost in time. Haunted places where entire families vanished without explanation. Post-mortem photography capturing more than it should. Forbidden rituals practiced in secret, disguised as harmless superstition. The woman with the jars belongs to this world of eerie details and sinister paths, where truth and myth blur together until no one can tell them apart. And yet, the story does not end with her death. Legends rarely do. Even now, some locals whisper that the earth around her cottage is cursed, that nothing grows there, that children who wander too close return home with aching teeth, or sometimes do not return at all. Some claim to have seen her ghost drifting through the woods, carrying a jar in her hands, her lips still pressed tightly shut. Perhaps it is only folklore, a way for small towns to explain the unexplainable. Or perhaps it is something far more sinister. For when an obsession is strong enough, when silence is deep enough, and when fear lingers long enough, history itself bends around it. And so the strange woman who collected teeth has never truly left us. She remains, etched into the unsettling history of 1885, a ghost among forgotten photographs, her story told in whispers and candlelight. But here is the most disturbing thought of all. Teeth do not decay like flesh or bone. They survive. They outlast us. Somewhere, scattered across attics, buried in fields, or locked in trunks, those jars may still exist. Rows of white enamel pressed against glass, silent witnesses to the horror storytelling of a woman who needed no words to be remembered. The mystery endures. The teeth endure. And her silence endures most of all. Now imagine this. You're alone in your room late at night. A faint rattling breaks the silence. At first you dismiss it. Pipes, maybe, or the shifting of the house. But then it comes again, glass clinking softly, rhythmically, as though jars are moving against each other. You turn to the shadows, and for the briefest moment, you think you see her, a pale woman, lips pressed shut, holding a jar close to her chest. Inside, something white presses faintly against the glass. Perhaps it is only imagination. Or perhaps her silence has found you. This was the story of the strange woman who collected teeth in silence, a fragment of our sinister past, an unsolved mystery that refuses to die, a piece of dark history forever lost in time. And so we leave you with this warning. Not all collections are harmless. Not all silences are peaceful. And not every photograph tells the truth. Thank you for walking with us into the shadows of forgotten events and chilling secrets. If you dare to return, the next story will be waiting, buried in dust, cloaked in silence, and perhaps holding something you were never meant to see. Until then, keep the lights low, keep your doors locked, and never ignore the sound of glass rattling in the night. Outro narration fades to silence.